It was late, and the streets were empty except for the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the cool night breeze. Officer Ryland Graves had been patrolling these roads for years, but tonight felt different. It wasn't the weather or the quiet, it was something inside him, a heaviness he couldn't shake, a familiar ache that always found its way back no matter how deeply he buried it. 2 years. It had been 2 years since he lost Arlo, his partner in every sense of the word. They had worked side by side, chasing down criminals and patrolling neighborhoods. But Arlo had been more than a K-9 officer. He had been Ryland's best friend, his confidant, the one constant in a life filled with chaos and unpredictability. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. He didn't want to think about it, but some nights, the memories crept in uninvited. The sound of Arlo's paws against the pavement, the way his ears perked up at the faintest sound, the warmth of his presence in the passenger seat, those memories were both a comfort and a wound that refused to heal. Ryland sighed, shaking his head as he focused on the road ahead. His cruiser's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty streets. The radio crackled with static, but no calls came through. Another quiet night. He should have been grateful, but the stillness only gave his mind more room to wander. He was nearing Elmwood Avenue when something darted into the road. His foot instinctively slammed on the brake, and the car skidded slightly on the wet asphalt. Heart pounding, he peered through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. A dog stood frozen in the beam of his headlights, its white fur gleaming in the rain. Ryland's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he was seeing a ghost. The dog looked exactly like Arlo, same build, same floppy ears, even the same black spot on its ear. "Arlo," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He shook his head, telling himself it wasn't possible. Arlo was gone, and no amount of wishful thinking could bring him back. But the resemblance was uncanny, and his heart ached with a mix of longing and disbelief. Ryland opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle, the cold air biting through his uniform. He crouched low, his hand extended as he spoke softly to the dog. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. I won't hurt you." The dog tilted its head, its tail wagging hesitantly. It took a cautious step forward, then another, until it was close enough for Ryland to touch. As his fingers brushed the dog's damp fur, a lump formed in his throat. The sensation was so familiar, so heartbreakingly familiar, that it felt like a cruel trick. "You're not him," he murmured, though part of him wished it could be true. The dog leaned into his hand, its eyes shining with a trust that made Ryland's chest tighten. He reached for the collar, squinting to read the tag in the dim light. The name engraved on it was Coda, followed by an address just a few blocks away. Reluctantly, Ryland stood and gestured toward his cruiser. "Come on, Coda. Let's get you home." The dog hesitated for a moment, then followed, hopping into the passenger seat as if it belonged there. Ryland couldn't help but smile, a small, bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As they drove, the rain picked up, tapping softly against the windows. Ryland glanced at Coda, who sat calmly, his head turning occasionally to watch the passing streets. "You know," Ryland said, breaking the silence, "you remind me so much of him. He used to sit just like that, all proud and calm, like he owned the world." Coda turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Ryland's. It was almost as if he understood, and the thought sent a shiver down Ryland's spine. By the time they reached the address on the tag, the rain had eased into a light drizzle. Ryland parked in front of a small, weathered house with an overgrown yard and a crooked mailbox. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of movement inside. Ryland knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. He waited, his breath visible in the cold air, but no one answered. He knocked again, louder this time, but the result was the same. "Looks like no one's home," he muttered, glancing down at Coda, who had followed him to the porch. He considered his options. Protocol dictated that he take the dog to the nearest shelter, but the thought of leaving Coda in a cold kennel didn't sit right with him. After a moment of hesitation, he made up his mind. "All right, buddy. Looks like you're spending the night with me." Coda wagged his tail as if in agreement, and together they returned to the cruiser. Back at his apartment, Ryland dried Coda off with an old towel, the dog standing patiently as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. The familiarity of the routine tugged at Ryland's heartstrings, and he found himself talking to Coda as he worked. You're a good dog, you know that? Remind me of him so much, it's almost spooky. Coda responded with a soft wag of his tail and a nudge against Ryland's hand. Later, as Coda curled up on the couch, Ryland sat across from him, staring into the flickering light of a single lamp. He picked up the dog's collar, turning it over in his hands. His thumb brushed against the tag, and he noticed something he hadn't seen before, an inscription on the back. It was faint, worn by time and weather, but he could just make out the words, "I miss you." The simple phrase hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at the tag, his mind racing. Who had written those words? What story did they tell? His thoughts were a tangle of curiosity and sorrow as he looked over at Coda, who was watching him with those same trusting eyes. "I don't know where you came from," Ryland said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think you were meant to find me." Coda wagged his tail, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the unspoken understanding between them. For the first time in a long time, Ryland felt something shift inside him, not the sharp sting of loss, but a small, fragile glimmer of hope. As the night wore on and the rain finally stopped, the city outside grew silent. In the stillness of his apartment, with Coda's steady breathing filling the air, Ryland allowed himself to close his eyes and dream of a time when the emptiness in his heart might finally begin to heal. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Ryland's living room, casting a warm glow over the modest space. Coda was still curled up on the couch, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Ryland watched him from the kitchen, sipping his coffee as memories of the previous night replayed in his mind. The tag. The inscription. Those 3 simple words had opened a door to questions he couldn't ignore. Who had written them? Was Coda lost, or had someone abandoned him? And why did fate decide to bring this dog, so eerily similar to Arlo, into his life now? Ryland sighed and set his mug down on the counter. He couldn't just keep Coda without trying to find his owner. The inscription hinted at a story, possibly one of loss, just like his own. He grabbed his laptop and settled on the couch beside Coda, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. After logging into a local pet registry database, Ryland typed in the address from Coda's tag. The house belonged to an elderly woman named Marjorie Hensley. According to the database, she'd registered Coda as her pet 3 years ago. There wasn't much else, but a quick search revealed a few articles mentioning her in the local news. Ryland's brow furrowed as he read one of the headlines. "Beloved community volunteer passes away at 78. The article was dated 6 months ago. Marjorie had died, leaving Coda behind. "Damn," Ryland muttered under his breath. He leaned back against the couch, his gaze drifting to Coda. "So you lost your person too, huh?" The dog opened one eye at the sound of Ryland's voice, wagged his tail faintly, then rested his head back down. Ryland ran a hand through his hair, unsure of what to do next. Without an owner, Coda had likely been wandering the streets, searching for something, or someone, that could never return. The thought tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. He spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. Animal shelters, rescue organizations, even a neighbor listed in Marjorie's obituary. None of them had any useful information about what had happened to Coda after her death. By the time Ryland hung up the last call, frustration was gnawing at him. He wanted answers, not just for Coda's sake but for his own. There was something about this dog, something that felt unfinished, like a story waiting to be told. Deciding to take a break, Ryland grabbed Coda's leash and clipped it onto the dog's collar. "Come on, buddy. Let's get out of here for a bit." They walked through the neighborhood, the crisp morning air refreshing after hours spent inside. Coda trotted beside Ryland, his tail wagging with each step. It was strange how natural it felt, as though they'd been walking together for years. The park wasn't far, and when they arrived, Ryland let Coda explore while he sat on a bench. He watched as the dog sniffed around, occasionally stopping to greet other parkgoers with a friendly wag. "Excuse me," a voice said, pulling Ryland out of his thoughts. He looked up to see a woman in her 60s standing nearby. She had kind eyes and carried a reusable grocery bag filled with fresh produce. "Is that Coda?" she asked, nodding toward the dog. Ryland's heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, that's his name. Do you know him?" The woman smiled wistfully. "I do. He belonged to Marjorie, my neighbor for almost 20 years. She loved that dog more than anything." Ryland gestured for her to sit, and she joined him on the bench. "I found him last night," he explained. "I didn't know where else to take him, so I brought him home. I was trying to figure out what happened to him after Marjorie passed." The woman nodded, her expression softening. After Marjorie died, her nephew came to settle her affairs. He wasn't much of a dog person, so he gave Coda to a friend. I guess that arrangement didn't work out. Rylan frowned. "He's been through a lot, hasn't he?" "He has," she agreed. "But he's a resilient one." Marjorie always said Coda had a way of finding the people who needed him most. The words lingered in the air, and Rylan felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at Coda, who had just flopped onto the grass, basking in the sunlight. "Maybe she was right," Rylan murmured. The woman patted his hand gently. "If you're thinking of keeping him, I don't think anyone would argue. He seems happy with you." Rylan hesitated. He'd spent so long building walls around his heart, afraid to let anything, or anyone, get too close. But Coda was different. He wasn't just any dog. He was a reminder of everything Rylan had lost and a chance to heal the parts of himself he'd buried. "I'll think about it," he said finally, though he already knew the answer. They talked for a while longer before the woman said goodbye, leaving Rylan alone with his thoughts. As he watched Coda roll onto his back, his paws in the air, Rylan felt a smile tug at his lips. "All right, buddy," he said, standing up. "Let's go home." Coda leapt to his feet, his tail wagging furiously as he followed Rylan back to the car. That night, as they settled in for another quiet evening, Rylan found himself reaching for the tag again. He traced the words with his thumb, feeling their weight in a way he hadn't before. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Coda looked up from his spot on the couch, his dark eyes filled with an understanding that felt almost human. For the first time in 2 years, Rylan allowed himself to hope, not just for closure, but for a new beginning. And as Coda rested his head on Rylan's lap, the emptiness in his heart didn't feel quite so vast anymore. The following days passed with a rhythm that felt strangely comforting. Rylan fell into a routine with Coda. Morning walks at the park, shared breakfasts where the dog shamelessly begged for scraps, and quiet evenings spent on the couch. It wasn't just the companionship that soothed him, it was the way Coda seemed to sense his moods, offering a nudge of reassurance when Rylan's thoughts turned dark. Yet, the inscription on the tag continued to haunt him. "I miss you" was more than a phrase. It was a lingering message from a past he didn't fully understand. Who had it been meant for? Marjorie? Someone else? Rylan felt an itch to uncover the story, not just out of curiosity, but because it felt tied to his own journey with Coda. One afternoon, Rylan decided to pay a visit to Marjorie's old house. The address from the tag was etched in his mind, and he felt a pull to see where Coda had come from. The drive wasn't long, but his nerves prickled as he approached the quiet suburban street. The house was modest, with a small garden in the front yard, overgrown now with weeds and wildflowers. Rylan parked his car and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. Coda, sensing his unease, whined softly from the back seat. "It's all right, buddy," Rylan said, more for himself than the dog. He rang the doorbell, half expecting no one to answer. To his surprise, a man in his late 40s opened the door. He had a weary expression and was dressed in an old flannel shirt. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone cautious. Rylan cleared his throat. "Hi, my name's Rylan. I found a dog recently, and his tag led me here. His name's Coda." The man's eyes widened, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Coda? Marjorie's dog?" Rylan nodded. "I think so. I wanted to learn more about him, about her. She seems like she was an amazing person." The man leaned against the doorframe, exhaling heavily. "She was my aunt. She passed away last year, and I was the one who had to handle everything after she was gone." "I'm sorry for your loss," Rylan said sincerely. The man nodded, then glanced past Rylan at the car. "Can I see him?" "Coda, I mean." Rylan opened the car door, and Coda hopped out, his tail wagging as he approached the man. The man crouched down, petting Coda with a wistful smile. "He looks good," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I didn't think I'd see him again." "What happened to him?" Rylan asked gently. The man straightened, his expression clouding. "I couldn't take care of him after Aunt Marjorie died. I gave him to a friend who promised to look after him, but I guess things didn't work out. I've been feeling guilty about it ever since." Rylan nodded, understanding the weight of regret. He's been through a lot, but he's doing okay now. I've been taking care of him. The man studied Rylan for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Marjorie would have liked you. She always believed Coda had a special way of bringing people together." Rylan hesitated before asking the question that had been nagging at him. "The tag on his collar, 'I miss you.' Do you know what it means?" The man's expression softened. That was something Aunt Marjorie used to say to him all the time. She'd whisper it to him when she thought no one was listening. I think she missed her late husband, and Coda was her comfort, her way of keeping a piece of him alive. Rylan's throat tightened as the words sank in. The tag wasn't just a message, it was a testament to a bond, a love that transcended loss. "Thank you," Rylan said quietly, "for telling me." The man nodded. "Take good care of him. He deserves a good home." "I will," Rylan promised. As he drove home with Coda in the passenger seat, Rylan felt a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. The inscription on the tag wasn't just Marjorie's goodbye to Coda. It was a reminder that love, even in its absence, could leave a lasting mark. That night, Rylan sat on the couch with Coda curled up beside him. He reached for the tag again, tracing the words with a newfound understanding. "I miss you," he whispered, this time without the weight of despair. Coda looked up at him, his dark eyes filled with quiet wisdom, and Rylan felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, with Coda by his side. The days turned into weeks, and Rylan's bond with Coda deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible. What started as a chance encounter with a dog that resembled his lost pet became a journey of healing, redemption, and self-discovery. Rylan found joy in the simple things again. Morning jogs with Coda, lazy Sunday afternoons at the park, and even mundane tasks like grocery shopping felt less burdensome with Coda's eager presence. He began to notice how people in his neighborhood responded to Coda's cheerful demeanor. Children waved to them, neighbors stopped to chat, and an older couple even commented, "That dog has a way of making people smile, doesn't he?" It wasn't just Coda who was changing. Rylan found himself opening up more, talking to people instead of brushing them off. He smiled more often, and the once frequent nightmares of his past were replaced with dreams of brighter days. But there was still something unresolved in Rylan's heart, a lingering sense that Coda's story, and perhaps his own, needed closure. The inscription on Coda's tag had become more than a mystery. It was a symbol of connection and loss, not just for Marjorie, but for Rylan too. One crisp autumn morning, Rylan decided to take Coda on a road trip. He packed a small bag, loaded Coda into the car, and set out toward the small town where Marjorie's home was. He wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to find, perhaps a sense of peace, or a way to honor Marjorie's memory. When they arrived, the town was quiet, its streets lined with golden leaves. Rylan parked near a small cafe and decided to walk through the town center. As they strolled, he noticed a quaint pet shop with a display of handmade collars and tags in the window. The sight sparked an idea, and he stepped inside. The shopkeeper, a kind woman named Helen, greeted him warmly. "What can I help you with?" she asked, smiling at Coda. "I'd like to get a new tag for my dog," Rylan said. "Something special?" Helen nodded. "Do you have something in mind?" Rylan thought for a moment, then said, "Can you engrave 'I found you'?" Helen's smile deepened. "That's beautiful. It'll take just a few minutes." As Rylan waited, he thought about how far he and Coda had come. The new tag wasn't just a replacement, it was a testament to their shared journey, a promise that they'd found each other when they both needed it most. When the tag was ready, Rylan attached it to Coda's collar and crouched down to show it to him. "What do you think, buddy? This feels right, doesn't it?" Coda wagged his tail, leaning into Rylan's touch. Their next stop was Marjorie's grave. With the help of her nephew, whom Rylan had spoken with weeks ago, he had found out where she was buried. The cemetery was peaceful, with rows of headstones shaded by old oak trees. Rylan approached her grave, Coda by his side, and knelt down to place a small bouquet of daisies, Marjorie's favorite flowers, as her nephew had told him. "I wanted to thank you," Rylan said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "for taking care of Coda and for being the kind of person who saw the good in him. He's brought me so much joy, More than I ever thought I'd feel again. Coda sat beside him, his head resting on Ryland's knee, as if he understood the weight of the moment. "I'll take care of him," Ryland continued. "I promise." As he stood to leave, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment, Ryland felt a strange sense of warmth, as if Marjorie herself were offering her blessing. The drive back to the city was quiet, but it wasn't heavy with sadness. Instead, Ryland felt a lightness, a sense that he'd done something meaningful, not just for Marjorie, but for himself. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became manageable, even beautiful in its imperfections. Ryland returned to work with renewed energy, his colleagues noticing the change in him. "You seem different," his partner, Officer Neal, remarked one day. "Happier." "I think I am," Ryland admitted, scratching Coda behind the ears as the dog lounged beside his desk. Ryland even found himself reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. At the park one evening, he met a woman named Evelyn, who was walking her golden retriever, Daisy. Their dogs played together while they talked, and Ryland felt an ease he hadn't experienced in years. Evelyn was kind, with a warm laugh and an open heart. She didn't pry into Ryland's past, but she listened when he chose to share. Their friendship blossomed naturally, and over time, it became something more. One evening, as they sat on a bench watching their dogs chase each other, Evelyn turned to Ryland and said, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Ryland nodded. "Yeah. But I think it's made me appreciate what I have now." She smiled. "I think that's why I like being around you. You don't take things for granted." Their relationship grew steadily, built on trust and mutual respect. Coda seemed to approve, often nudging Evelyn's hand for attention or curling up at her feet. Months turned into a year, and Ryland found himself surrounded by a life he'd never imagined, one filled with love, friendship, and purpose. Coda remained a constant source of joy, his boundless energy and unwavering loyalty a reminder of how far they'd both come. One evening, as Ryland sat on the porch of his home, watching the sunset with Coda by his side, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something softer, a part of him that no longer defined him. Coda nudged his hand, and Ryland smiled, scratching behind his ears. "We did good, didn't we, buddy?" Coda wagged his tail in response, his eyes filled with the same unspoken understanding that had brought them together in the first place. Ryland looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. He had found Coda, and in doing so, he had found himself.